Good afternoon. So my name is Alex Blanchette. For those who don't know me, I'm a professor in the Department of Anthropology. I'm the sorry substitute for Dr. Gomez today. Just wanted to say at the start, thanks as always to Daphne Hope Cunningham and Roland Hope. They're the namesake of this series, and their support makes our gatherings possible. I believe we're probably passing a sign-up sheet for anyone who would like to be involved on a regular basis with these talks. We meet here every Thursday, almost without exception. I also have an announcement. Today is Tufts Pollinator Initiative Day on campus, and this talk is what is kicking us off. We would love to have you at some of our other events today. At 2:30 p.m. at the Pollinator Garden at 574 Boston, we'll be doing a native seeds distribution. We'll have hot cider donuts, and we're going to hear from some people from across the Tufts community as a whole, from SMFA, from Medford, and possibly from Grafton on some of their ongoing ecological initiatives. At 4:30 in Alumni Lounge up here, 40 Talbot Avenue, will be our main event. We'll be doing a roundtable featuring today's speaker alongside the urban ecologist and TPI co-founder Nick Dorian, the really quite avant-garde ecological artist Erwin Woodbury, and quilter and horticulturalist Leslie Rogers. Together, this kind of really unique and unruly set of people whose thinking spans fields are going to be asking hard questions, open-ended questions, thinking and speculating together. What could a university ecology be? What kind of campus ecologies do we want at a place like Tufts? And with that, let me introduce today's distinguished speaker. This is not his first time speaking at the Hoku series. He spoke back in 2022. And we do not typically host speakers twice. Indeed, if I'm not mistaken, it's slightly frowned upon. I'm not actually sure that Mark Bomford is a single person. His official job title is the director of the Yale Sustainable Food Program. He's affectionately known as Yale's farmer-in-chief, annually, as I learned last night, annually serving some 40 classes through experiments on a 1-acre urban farm. He also founded the Center for Sustainable Food Systems at the University of British Columbia, where he built a 60-acre teaching and research farm. Intellectually, he's affiliated with the world-leading program in agrarian studies at Yale and the School of Geography at Oxford. In the other side of his life, Mark is also something of an interdisciplinary autodidact whose critical scholarly work on controlled indoor farming is becoming widely influential across anthropology, sociology, and geography. Back in 2022, he gave us a great presentation from that part of his life, and today he will reflect on how he thinks about university ecologies, a domain that he's been shaping for 25 years. In other words, he's really quite a profound thinker and a profound doer. I think he really just shakes up the very lines separating these two domains, and it's really great to have him back at Tufts. So please welcome Mark.
CNET and Bo, how are the levels sounding? Wonderful. Hello, everybody. Thank you very much, Alex, for that kind introduction. If you put on your ethnographer hats right now, you can observe the subtle non-verbal negotiation that two Canadians make when they're away from their home country as to where the apology properly belongs. So is it me who has to apologize for failing to fulfill the impossibly high expectations that Alex has set for this talk? Or is it Alex who owes me an apology for making me walk right into this trap of unfulfillable expectations of a wonderful talk? I'll do my best. This is the third most displayed slide in my presentations for classroom teaching. This is in 1899. It's in the Thunder Hill colony on the Manitoba-Saskatchewan border, pretty far north. These women are pulling a sod-breaking plow. When you normally pull a plow, the history between that plow and the soil and the oxen that pulled that plow, and the oxen's tolerance for being compelled to do work by being poked behind the ears with a long pointy stick called an ox goad. Those relationships form the basis for what we now know as 1 acre. Basically, if you were a medieval ox driver and you had your pair of oxen, you could compel these oxen through really irritating pokes with this stick behind the ears, which they really hate, to drag a plow through the soil. You would get to a unit which now we've kind of formalized as 1 furlong. It's 660 feet. And it's a concatenation of the words furrow and length. So furrow, length, furlong, the furrow being the piece of soil which is turned over by the plow as you move it through. So you go 1 furrow length in previously cultivated soil, and you end up with this dimension furlong. You do that all day, waiting for the ox to resist, get tired, say, this sucks, I need a break. You turn it around, and each time you turn it around, you are kind of going 1 rod over. That's the distance of your pointy stick. You do that until everybody gets tired, and the amount of land that you've cultivated is 1 acre. So that imagination about what constitutes an area of land on the planet's surface, from which we derive all manner of troubling constructs about whether this land is being well used, whether this land is being improperly used, whether this land is efficient, whether this land is inefficient, whether this land is marginal, whether this land is productive, whether it's fertile. Really, these all rest upon a rather contingent relational expression of how oxen and soil and people and physical exhaustion and labor all kind of come together. But there's nothing about an acre that you can bring to me. If I asked you, everybody, I want you to bring to class tomorrow an acre which is important to you in your life, you would not be able to do it because you can't actually disembed that abstract thing from the place that it's in. This particular example, you can kind of do the math on it and say, okay, yeah, a pair of 9 women, that's 18. That's about equivalent horsepower-wise to 2 oxen or 1 small draft horse. Roughly 1 horsepower you would have if you did the math on it. But when you're busting sod, when you're doing plowing into soil that hasn't been plowed before, you have to work about 5 times as hard. So while this work, if you were using previously plowed soil, you could kind of get away with using this kind of math of 18 humans equals 1 pair of oxen, you can't do it on newly plowed soil. What are these people doing? These are Doukhobor women. The Doukhobors were expelled from Tsarist Russia in the late 1800s because they were practicing radical pacifism. They refused to join the draft. They set their rifles on fire, their government-issued rifles on fire, and so they had to go. It's not easy to pick up and leave a country. You need help. In the case of the Doukhobors, they had help from the author Leo Tolstoy. Having had somewhat of a transcendent spiritual reawakening that ended up combining this idea of good, honest agricultural labor with spiritual transcendence, Tolstoy was basically taking a vow of poverty, and now that he was rich and famous, he'd always been fairly rich, he was giving all of his money towards these causes that he saw as being spiritually just, and the Doukhobors' plight and their persecution was one that he was really intent on seeing resolved. And it seemed like there was a match in Canada where 1/3 of the Doukhobors ended up on the Northern Prairie. So they had funds from Tolstoy, but they also needed something on the Canadian side that enabled them to be there right now in this photo. That something was an initiative from the government of Canada, which was meant to people the prairie. There's a lot going on in that phrase, people in the prairie. And this specifically was a historical reaction to the Red River resistance. that basically you had a group of Métis in southern Manitoba who had declared sovereignty. The reason why they had resisted and said, we want to be a sovereign nation, was because the British Crown had tried to impose all sorts of legible order. Legibility is one of the political scientist James C. Scott's terms. You'll find it in the wonderful book, Seeing Like a State. We lost Jim Scott last summer. Sadly, he's a dear friend, very much missed. His idea that you needed to impose on top of this, I guess, locally lived experience in a place, this spatial ordering, which in the case of the British Crown was a grid. The grid that they imposed was based on the common law definition of the acre. And so in this uniform half-mile by half-mile grid in this country, it's called the Jeffersonian grid, even though Thomas Jefferson did not invent it. They overlaid it on top of the prairie to make it legible to the centralized accountants back in London, for example, to be able to order and parcel out the prairie, because the Métis used their own system, which was based on river frontage. If you want to have a plot of land that you can actually get your products out of and send them off to market, you want to have a transportation network. No roads, the river is your transportation network, and so you ended up with what in Detroit are called ribbon farms, these long plots. And so this became absolutely untenable when the British Crown said, no, the new survey is making these squares based on 160 acres. The battles that followed, the expense, the colonial embarrassment, made the Crown decide that the next group of people who came over had to be somewhat more orderly. They were thinking of a very specific archetype of hardy Eastern European stock, people who worked hard and didn't complain and would not have problems with the grid that they had imposed. The Doukhobors seemed to fit the bill. When these photos were published in the first season of the Doukhobor colonization of the Northern Prairie, the state responded very positively. Look at how hard they're working. You know, they don't even have draft animals. They're using their women instead to pull the plows. You know, this is the kind of hardy working stock that we need. Tolstoy was ecstatic. You can read the letters back and forth. You can see how appreciative he is of this transcendent spiritual work which is happening. You know, this is exactly the kind of pacifist, hardworking agrarian community that he envisioned and that he wanted to fund. Okay. There was some time later a breakout sect of the Doukhobors called the Sons of Freedom, who are really into arson and nudity. And the Royal Canadian Mounted Police actually stole all their kids and sent them to the internment camps in New Denver, British Columbia, which had been recently emptied by the Japanese that they had interred during the Second World War. But the whole story here is the oversight of a state trying to make legible not just the land, but also the people, the right kind of people, the right kind of land, the right kind of people, trying to impose an order. Now, I never studied Tolstoy, right? The only reason why I know any of this is because we were developing at the Yale farm a course on Russian literature and ecology. This was through the Slavic studies major, but it was wildly interdisciplinary, and we had people coming from all over the university to take this course. It was wildly popular. And one of the things we were trying to do is take that passage in Anna Karenina, where you have Konstantin Levin, who is harvesting this wheat field with the peasants who work his land. And you know, Levin was Tolstoy's most autobiographical character. You sort of have this expression in Levin of exactly how Tolstoy was feeling at the moment, which led to his conversion, which led to him funding the Doukhobors to settle in Canada. And in this passage, you know, he's in bliss, he's in ecstasy because of the spiritual transcendence of this honest agricultural labor. Of course, is completely oblivious to the fact that he has a choice in this matter. The peasants who are working beside him do not have a choice in this matter, and they never have, right? We wanted to explore some of these themes, especially when it came to labor. What is the difference between labor that is giving you utility and sovereignty and self-efficacy, and what is the kind of labor that is drudgery, that sucks, that is coercive, that is not where you want to be, right? And we're trying to tease this out. And one of the things that came up was, well, what kind of wheat was this in Anna Karenina? What kind of wheat was Levin actually harvesting? We started to look around for genetic matches. We've been experimenting with different cultivars of wheat as well as land races at the Yale farm for quite some time, because everything that we plant at the Yale farm is based on some kind of teaching objective. So if we have students who are working with the Assyriologists at the Beinecke Library, where you have these people, there's like 3 of them in the world who are fluent in reading cuneiform, and you can go to the Beinecke, and as you're a student, you can, paw up these 4,000-year-old clay cuneiform tablets. And you've got someone right there who can translate for you and all this kind of stuff. So for those students, we planted an Emmer land race that seemed to be a close genetic match to what was going on in ancient Babylonia. For some of the genetic students, I was telling folks at dinner last night about a new contemporary land race called Skagit 1109 that we are actually breeding after a lovely gift from Steve Jones at the Bread Lab at Washington State University, where we are making our own land race, which is an expression of the Yale farm in New Haven, Connecticut. But for Anna Karenina, what cultivar is going to be your closest match? We ended up settling on one called Ukrainka. It was, they had some of it at the Nikolai Vavilov Institute in Kiev. It was the most widely planted cultivar up until the early 1920s throughout Russia, throughout Eastern Europe. And we managed to get some seeds of Ukrainka to the Yale farm shortly before Putin's invasion. So our timing was pretty good there. And we've been growing it out, and the idea is that our students can participate in relation with a plant which is roughly the same as what Levin would have been hanging out with the peasants in Anna Karenina. Same kind of stature, same kind of ripening, same kind of uniformity in terms of what you can expect to be ready, what you can expect to not be ready, all these kind of characteristics, the traits genetically, trying to get the closest match so that then they can kind of follow through and figure out what do you do with that wheat, how do you actually thresh it, how do you clean it, how do you turn it into something that you can actually eat. And in these kind of exercises, the work which is happening should be horrible, right? And yet it is not. Oh, I messed up the order of the slides. So this is winnowing. You can actually see a Vornado fan behind that winnowing basket. Is taking place of the wind, which you normally use for winnowing in a tray. Basically, once you have threshed the wheat and separated it from the stems, you're tossing it up in the air, letting the wind blow the chaff away. There's a reason why in the English language, words having to do with threshing wheat connote futility. So, if you're thrashing around, it means that you're going nowhere. This is horrible work, which is leading you no place. The tool that you used before a threshing machine to thresh wheat is a flail. So if you're flailing around, that means that you are doing bad work. This is drudgery. In this case, somehow, through the magic of something or other, we've managed to turn it into a lovely day at the farm. Intellectually enriching, and we argue, and the students generally agree, that's providing something that can't quite be captured in the classroom. There is an enrichment to what's being studied in the classroom that is only obtainable through embodied practice. And what we're trying to do is attend not just to the bodies of the students in terms of what are they doing, what kind of labor are they doing, but also what's going on with the plants, And is this something where we can kind of bring these things in relation, the work that the soil is doing, the work that the plants are doing, the work that the students are doing, et cetera, et cetera. This is illegible. This is totally irrational. If you were to describe what's going on, describe the effort in trying to track down the genetics, describing the inspiration of seeing those Doukhobor women plowing, describing what these students who might be making $250,000 at McKinsey right after they graduate, what the net present value of their time threshing wheat by hand at Yale is, this is just the stupidest thing you could ever imagine. There is no reason behind any of this, right? And this is where I'm leading in to the kind of paradox of care and control when it comes to how we are treating our campus landscape. This is a picture of a thoroughly and radically unreasonable landscape at the Yale farm, right? When you ask what you see there, I think the common answer is, I see a mess. By further extension, I see an area that nobody cares about. I see an area that nobody is working on. I see an area which is missing TLC, which is missing labor. You know, clearly this is something that people have walked away from. In some ways, it's that absence of people that leads you to believe there's no care. You know, I look at this and I say, well, this could be anything. This is full of future possibility. I see the asparagus lurking underneath that mugwort. I know that once the mugwort is cleared away, that those asparagus are going to flourish, they're going to photosynthesize, they're going to pack sugar into their root systems, and we will have our 20th year of lovely asparagus coming up the next spring. I see the hops. I know that once those hops are taken off their trellises and once they're fully dried, I know that the students are going to be making Yale ale with them. I can almost anticipate what it's going to taste like as it comes out of its blue bottles, which are quite aesthetically sublime. You know, I can kind of feel the aromas when you harvest hops by hand. You know, you can feel the light buzz that comes when the oils in hops kind of make it through your fingers and enter your bloodstream, right? I can imagine the smells that's going to happen in the spring with the decaying leaves, et cetera, et cetera. And yet it is a big out of control mess. I just want to contrast this with a perfectly ordered agricultural landscape circa 2023. This is the interior of a very, very well-funded vertical farm. There is really only one vertical farm left in the last, two vertical farms left. In the last 5 years, they've managed to destroy about $4.2 billion in my estimate of capital that was invested and has kind of evaporated in the various bankruptcies. The ordering here, though, is comprehensive. Everything is precisely mapped out. The drone that you see was the promise to make the entire farm go dark, as they say in industry parlance, which is that we're going to run it without people. It's all going to be automated. The drone will sort of get the data. The data will guide all of the various actuators and things that irrigate and bring the water in and take the water away and bring the nutrients in and take the nutrients away and harvest and all that kind of stuff. This is completely fake, by the way. It was a press release with a partnership from Nokia that was talking about how they were going to be using drones. They never did use drones. And because they never did use drones, this is absolutely photoshopped. This was the original photo. And it's interesting that the thing that they chose to take out, to remove, was the person, right? That was the major bit of editing, was trying to remove the person. And it's only through removal of the person and removal of this idea of human labor that you can claim complete efficiency, that you can claim complete legibility. You know, part of the practice of making legible and overlaying those grids, whether that is spatially, whether that's temporally, part of turning a place into a space is removal of the people and removal of those relationships. What I'm making an argument here for is that the campus landscape can be used to rebuild those relationships, reconnect the things that have been severed when you have this very legible ordered grid that has been imposed upon a landscape for reasons of measuring and managing, optimizing, making efficient, scaling. And I would give this as another example. They're threshing again. This is beans. These beans are part of this is part of an indigenous food sovereignty class. They're preparing for the indigenous fall feast that actually just happened last Friday at the farm. They're using everything that came out of the Three Sisters garden, which is a work now 15 years in the making, because rather than just sort of saying, oh, we need to get these 3 different plants and they're going to work together in some kind of polycultural harmony, we realized that it was not just the plants, it was not just the cultivars, it was the relations that the indigenous seed keepers had with each of those plants that made them work together. So trying to restore those relations so that those gifts of seed can be brought back to the farm in a way that they actually work together well was central to this. And the end result is that what would normally be considered drudgery ends up being emancipatory. To that end, we don't grow so much food anymore. When we began, the goal was towards high-end, direct marketed mixed vegetable production. That was sort of the vision, I think, of the new organic growing movement that was really spearheaded by Eliot Coleman in Maine on this coast. And the idea that you would sort of have these small self-sufficient homesteads and that you would go to the farmer's market and that we could kind of like reconfigure how cities are fed through these small farmers markets. That was the idea that was being pursued. I'm arguing that that did not transcend the kind of productivist viewpoint where what you're aiming for is saying, you know, we need to produce a certain amount because we need to make it economically viable, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm not saying that this is a bad approach. It's a necessary approach if you're farming, but we're not farming at Yale, right? What we're trying to do is make people think with such imagination that they are prepared to respond to problems that we don't even know are problems yet. So here, we're working with dyes, we're working with fibers, we're working with oil crops, we're working with energy crops, we're working with flowers, we're working with everything, including food. But what we're emphasizing is my mantra: no one thing does just one thing. You know, there's got to be multifunctionality built throughout. There's got to be relational multifunctionality built throughout. I developed this idea at the University of British Columbia, started very much as a conventional farm. As you went through the marginalization in agriculture in the province and in North America, where there was increasing automation, where fewer people were involved in agriculture, you went through a parallel marginalization at the academy that mirrored what was happening in the broader economy. And every time that agriculture was sort of pushed into economic subservience, the farm moved on campus. They would say, this land is too important, we're moving it further south. This land is too important, we're moving it further south. We need this for parking lots, we need this for playing fields, we need this for the new science building. And every time that happened, they shifted the farm further south, further south, further south, until they ended up with this strange configuration. This is the mid-1960s. They called it rooms in the forest. So they sort of like cleared out these areas in this 100-year-old coastal hemlock association. And they decided that each discipline was going to have its proper separation with the trees between them. So you might have soil science over here, because of course they had no reason to talk to the plant scientists, and the plant scientists had no reason to talk to the botanists. I seriously, when I came here to try and like make people work together, I had to negotiate a fight between a botanist and a plant scientist over someone who had taken the wrong wheelbarrow, and they were insisting that their research had nothing to do with one another. And this fragmentation, this kind of like disciplinary severance, was sort of cut across knowledge, very much like a grid cut across the landscape when it was plopped to make legible by a surveyor, it led to a legitimate decline, so that people believed that there was no future at this farm anymore. It was a place, because it had no future, it opened up the entitlement to colonize. In this case, it was, we're going to turn it into housing development. It's not housing development today, for one reason that I would like to think is the main reason, for the other reason, which is probably a little bit more banal and less interesting. But I want to share you the idea that I think made it not housing today, the idea that I think protected the farm from housing. The banal idea for the planners in the room was a density transfer. Those towers there, the official community plan said that they were going to be low rises. They said they were going to be, this is specifically for you, Michael. I don't know if there's other urban planners in the room right now. Those towers are 18 stories high. So if you build up, if the people go high, then the ecologies, the field-based ecologies can stay field-based. But anyways, it's not housing. And the reason I think was because the multiplicity, the relational multiplicity of no one thing does just one thing was so compelling. And I'm happy that this is the pollinator day, because the metaphor I used to express this and try and make the case persuasive was the bees. If you start with a honeybee, this is, of course, a European honeybee. It's an Apis mellifera. But they are all over farms, in part because people like to harvest their honey. But increasingly, they've become more valuable as pollinators. And if you follow one of our honeybees, you realize in a very visible way, maybe even more visible than if you dig the idea of rhizomes as your metaphor, you have this communication between various disciplines. So in this case, our honeybees were research subjects. They were being used by scientists at the Center for High Throughput Biology who had a very fancy mass spectrometer. And they were able to, using mass spectroscopy, they were able to do sort of rapid predictive breeding to try and breed in behavioral traits that gave resistance to the varroa mite, which was a big problem for apiculture around the province. So you had these, you had that genetic science, but the bees were off doing the things that bees do, which is pollinating all the crops on the farm. I chose the butternut squash here just because the butternut squash was the site of about 5 different research projects simultaneously. So down there, this artist has pictured a biofertilizer trial where we were using different strains of yeast to try and modulate the availability of organic nutrients. So, one of the problems with organic growing is that you don't necessarily get the plant available nutrition coming off of those complex organic molecules at the right time. And the idea was, let's use this yeast as a moderator to try and sort of like attenuate when the stuff comes off and when it doesn't. Once they were harvested, right, nicely pollinated by the honeybees, of course, they ended up in the pizza joint at the Student Union Building, a very popular place where our food, nutrition, and health students had figured out these nutritionally balanced recipes where they're sort of like making sure that if a student ate the butternut squash pizza, that it would contain everything that student needed. And that it was also delicious and the people craved it. And our food, resource, and economics students were working on the marketing plans and making sure that the whole thing was going to be a profitable operation as well. And when you look through this, you've got the honeybee kind of as this translator between all sorts of different ways of knowing. In every case, you have the students benefiting, you have the students given some problems that are going to really enrich what they can do above and beyond what would be possible in the classroom alone. So that's what I hope made the case compelling. What I actually think made the case compelling was my promise that we would measure everything, right? So these images were actually taken from a slide that I gave when I presented the academic plan to the Senate, to the Academic Senate. And you have the artist's conception of what it would look like to measure complexity, to measure heterogeneity, to measure difference in a complex landscape, right? That, unfortunately, is fiction, right? This is more to the reality. It was after I left that we finally succeeded in getting a grant from Agriculture Canada to measure greenhouse gas fluxes across some different agricultural fields. The kind of gold standard in measuring greenhouse gas flux at a landscape level like this is eddy covariance. This is an instrument at the top of an eddy covariance tower. This is actually a sonic anemometer. Anemometer is a nice high-value word if you want to use it. It measures wind speed. Most of the time, it's like little cups that spin around. In this case, your sonic anemometer, those little tips at the end of the claws, those are transducers. So they kind of switch over from like, I'm a speaker, now I'm a microphone, now I'm a speaker, now I'm a microphone, 20 times per second. And what happens is they shoot a sound pulse between opposing claws. And when you couple that, this is the covariance part, with infrared pulses through a gas chamber, you can get a sense of how much carbon dioxide is coming, how much carbon dioxide is going. This all sounds great. You can even see there was an eddy covariance tower and the artist's impression of how we would measure greenhouse gas fluxes on diverse landscapes. The problem is this. When you finally pay for an eddy covariance tower, which is like 200K, when you finally do that and you need to justify that you are producing legitimate knowledge, the kind of journals that will accept your data are very, very fussy about the confounding factors that might give alternative explanations to the result that you're claiming to have. So working with the biometeorologists whose knowledge of the math behind all of this stuff was just outstanding, we realized that we could only make these things work, we could only get publishable data if we had a 500-meter radius, that's a 1 kilometer circle, 0.6 miles for the imperial folks in the room. That radius had to be entirely uniform. One single commodity crop, no hedgerows, no waterways. To get a space that uniform, that large, is a tall order, even in Western Canada in the Lower Fraser Valley. That's a very difficult uniformity to find. It's impossible to find in the Northeast. It's impossible to find in most agricultural systems around the world where there's far more diversity and the plots are much, much smaller than what we're talking about, right? Because when you have something that size, you're basically dealing with that 640-acre grid, more or less, that has caused so much problem over time. So what this means is that as we set out to measure everything, we are not measuring objectively because we are changing the object of our consideration. So what this reveals is that there is no observer. There is only participation, right? You find this often where in order to actually know, you have to get a complex ecology and somehow in a Procrustean act of slicing and dicing, you need to make it conform to a laboratory-like setting. So even if you're doing field ecology, even if you're working in the great outdoors, and even if you sort of said like where we want to deal with complexity, we are stepping outside the laboratory for a moment. To get the kind of knowledge that is legitimate, that is respectable, that in Amartya Sen's phrasing would be admissible, right? You know, it's like court admissible evidence. You know, do you have evidence that can be admitted into a scientific journal, or is it non-admissible? Is it going to be cut off in peer review? To do that kind of thing, it forces you to make the landscape homogeneous so that by the time you've got your measurements and by the time you've got the certainty and by the time you have the kind of like respectable, I know this for sure, you end up with a system that no longer resembles the thing that you set out to understand in the first place. So how do you get around this? Well, you can get around this, and Tufts can get around this, because you don't have a College of Agricultural Sciences. When I was at the University of British Columbia, that does very much have a conventional College of Agricultural Sciences, now called the Faculty of Land and Food Systems. Many agricultural colleges across the world went through an identity crisis about 15 years ago and tried to get anything that kind of represented farming or agriculture out of their titles. And so we are land and food systems at UBC now. When I tried to make a pitch to someone outside of agriculture, so I could spend months setting up a meeting with the head of the Department of Family Practice in the med school, basically to make the case, saying like, the way that we are training doctors in the province right now needs a radical rethinking of food and nutrition and farming. I could make that pitch and they would say, that is a great idea. You're absolutely right. Now go back to the agriculture school where you belong. Stay in your lane, right? So when you're thinking of campus ecologies, it is a great asset that Tufts does have a commitment to many of the foundational principles of the liberal arts, right? The breadth that's needed, the imagination that's required, because you've got an opportunity to move towards a radical rethinking of what sustainability even means. And this, I would argue, is one that moves away from ideas of equilibrium and moves towards ideas of multiplicity. How many futures does this site have, right? If our challenge with sustainability is how do we deal with shocks? How do we deal with weather, which is becoming increasingly strange? How do we deal with the droutier droughts and the floodier floods and the fierier fires, et cetera, right? The response space that we need, the multiplicity, which is like, it could be this, it could be this, it could be this, that becomes rather crucial. And so I would argue that that liberal arts approach, which is not prescriptive of a single future, which is not saying you are being trained to be an engineer right now, but you are gaining the tools where you can respond to the problems that we don't know are problems yet, right? That is something which you already have here that can be applied towards your questions of how are we dealing with the places that we inhabit, right? I give you this because I know that showing that weedy bank in my asparagus and hops patch is not a good way to be persuasive to anybody, right? I have worked so that we have a gradual and gentle introduction to the weird multiplicity and trying to unlearn the aesthetic of order and control that I believe right now remains central to conceptions of equilibrium-based sustainability. So we greet you with flowers. This is the street-facing view. The idea is you want to make something splendid, you want to make something welcoming, you want to make something uplifting as you greet people and as you try to make a community. And then as you move further and further back on the farm, well, in my view, that's when it gets interesting. In other people's views, that might be when it gets uncomfortable. They're often the same thing. The flowers, because I've held by this idea that no one thing does just one thing, are not just there as a pretty face to the farm, right? Like most urban soils, we have widespread lead contamination in New Haven. I'm sure you've got it all over here as well, right? There is no amount of lead which is safe in a human body. So this front-facing bed, this has high levels of lead. We don't want to grow food in there. Growing flowers in there is a way that we can accomplish several things at once. But the thing that I think is most important about growing flowers in this lead-contaminated soil is it provides a provocation to think about what we mean by contamination and what we mean by purity. When you ask people, this lead-contaminated soil, what kind of soil is that? You know, it's normally, well, it's a lead-contaminated soil. It's a bad soil, right? And then we work through, well, what is that lead doing? Well, if that lead is in the soil, it's not doing much. And what would happen if the lead was not in the soil anymore? Well, then it might be in our bodies. Right. So what you can do is say, well, actually, thank you, soil, for keeping that lead out of our bodies. By staying contaminated, by remaining as a bad soil, you are providing us a very valuable service, right? You are locking up something that we cannot tolerate in our bodies whatsoever. And if our approach was saying we need to remediate, we need to cleanse this soil of its lead, we need to experiment with microremediation, we need to experiment with bioremediation, we need to experiment with all these different kinds of things, we would lose that provocation to say, what is this place doing anyways, right? What might it be doing for us that we don't recognize? Where is gratitude required when we might not recognize that gratitude is required? And so with that in mind, I give the students a subversive mission. The formal mission that appears on our website of the Yale Sustainable Food Program is on the farm, in the classroom, and around the world. The Yale Sustainable Food Program grows food literate leaders. Who can argue with that? The subversive mission is that I'm asking our students to cultivate radical humility. Humility is a fun word because, of course, it is the same roots as humus, which is that wonderful soil fraction that we don't know if it's coming or going. Is it alive? Is it dead? It's a really cool one, but it sort of reflects in most religions that we come and go from the soil. We are dust to dust and ashes to ashes and all that. And appropriately, the root word is also where the word human comes from. And so in humility, we are saying we are of the place that we inhabit, and we're going back to the place that we inhabit. The radical part, I'm not talking about just being angry or reactionary. I'm using the roots there too, which is quite literally the roots. Radicus, which means root. It means you're digging deeper, right? And as you look for the deeper causes behind the symptoms of the things that you see expressed in the world around you, you'll notice that roots are never singular. As you go back in histories, the roots are always, always, always multiple. Quite literally when you dig around in the soil as well as when you theorize it. But then that final one, cultivate, is the most difficult one of all. And I'm hoping it can be left here as a kind of like troublesome word for you to think about. So if you look at the roots of cultivate, again, you have like a Latin root. And some of the connotations of that root word cultus involve making sacred. It's sort of like taking a space that no one cared about, kind of like drawing a line around it and making it something special, adding value where there was no value before, right? Putting your labor into this piece of land. It's special now, you know? The cultus also is where cultivation as pretext for colonization comes from entirely. So during colonial settlement, when cultivation of the soil was not observed, when there was no legibility to cultivation, that was the entitlement. It's not being cultivated, so we are entitled to cultivate it. And so that is where I want us to settle, is on that care and control paradox. I'm not asking us to resolve it. I'm asking us to keep it alive. As Donna Haraway says, let's stay with the trouble on this one. That care cultivation nexus is very troubling. And I think it can lead to a lot of futures. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark. Do you have any questions?
Thanks for that fantastic talk. You talked a lot about drudgery, and you associated with both free will, and you showed us the women harness to the breaking sod. Is there something about looking at the multiplicity of all these different things that are doing different things that might help relieve that problem of drudgery? I'm thinking there was that 1920s in Russia, the guy Chkalov, do you know him? He was an agriculture economist who calculated, the drudgery factor in peasant households. And
Yeah, Chayanov.
Chayanov, right, Chayanov, thanks. So I thought you were taking a riff off that. So is there a way to do that now? Like, at what point does this kind of thing become drudgery?
Yeah, I was absolutely taking a riff off of A.V. Chayanov's work. He wrote a book called The Theory of Peasant Economies, and it was translated into English in the late 1960s. Yeah, it is a touchstone because he is talking about how these things are negotiated in a non-market economy. And the argument is that the market economy that kind of creates the conditions for efficiency and optimization and valuable and non-valuable is a weird, fringy thing for most of human society. And so he is trying to understand what's going on in definitely a non-market economy and how these things are negotiated. Yeah, I think multiplicity is absolutely key. All right. I'm also drawing on Anne-Marie Moll's ideas of multiplicity when it comes to the body multiple. You can apply that to so many things where it doesn't have to be that you are kind of locked in this never being able to land with a clear identity, but that opening up of the future, that opening up of the multiple future possibilities. It can lead you to proceed, I suppose, in a way where if you only see one direction, then you are, I mean, it's a bummer. One of the things about Anna Karenina is its opening line, all happy families are alike, all unhappy families are unhappy in their own way. When you achieve perfection, when you are the happy family, when you are Disney clean, when you are the happiest place on earth, there's only one way you can go. There's only one future, and it's worse, right? If you achieve perfection, then your future is only worse, right? If you are always imperfect, then you have multiple futures. And that's hopeful, and that can keep you going.
Sorry, y'all are making me run across the room.
Thank you. Thank you for the talk. You mentioned offhand that a lot of universities changed the name of their programs away from agriculture and farming, and I was wondering if you could talk about why that was.
Agriculture and farming is really uncool. They were having difficulty attracting students. The narrative that we've had about agricultural progress and about economic progress has been very much a very fast retreat from agriculture as something which is desirable at all. And they were faced with that. They were faced with that larger thing. And so it was just a matter of rebranding and getting students to come.
It's on. Thank you for a really stimulating talk. So one of the things that I noticed when I became director of environmental studies years ago is a lot of schools have environmental science programs. A lot of schools have environmental studies programs. They don't always talk to one another. As you described the work that's being done on your farm, you both described very disciplinary kinds of foci from departments that came together at UBC. But my sense is what you're doing at Yale is truly interdisciplinary. You're not. And so I was wondering if you could describe a little bit about how courses are really crossing disciplines that are coming to the Yale farm and how the university is supporting it.
Some of that is bound up in a commitment to the liberal arts, where there is an openness to the idea that you might be collaborating with a discipline outside of your normal field, that you might be well outside of your lane. That is not frowned upon when you do have that kind of core undergraduate philosophy. Otherwise, I don't know. It is difficult because the currency of each individual discipline is going to be slightly different. The incentives are going to be aligned differently, and especially when you get into the more research-intensive environment where the graduate schools are spending most of their days. It's really hard to actually find an embrace of that. That's one of the reasons why we are located in Yale College, and we're not located in a place that would be perfectly sensible for us to be, like the graduate Yale School of the Environment, right? We're not there yet. So it is a work in progress. It is something that you can do with support, and it can work out well at the undergraduate level when you've got that commitment to liberal arts. When you are already streamlined into a set of disciplinary incentives and into the expectations that the students have upon graduation, it is frankly still very difficult to achieve that interdisciplinarity.
Thanks so much, Mark. This was really great. I'm curious about the part where you talked about that intangible learning that comes from seeing it. And so if it's intangible, it's really hard to measure. But
Yes.
what are some things that you can do to cultivate or to grow those sorts of moments in the farm that are really hard to characterize?
Right. Through practice, through developing narratives, through imagery, you'll see that a couple of the images that I had there from UBC were artistic renderings. We were working with landscape architects and planners and people who are very good at kind of like the improvisational visuals. And so all of those, like those images that you saw were done kind of real time. We had an artist sketch these out as we were in conversation. So we were sort of like saying, here's what's in my head, and they were drawing it. There's something about when you talk about intangible, there's a reason why there was no text on my slides, right? I want to think more expansively, kind of break free of the confines of text and text alone. And in many ways, it's by positioning us as an enrichment for text-based study that the university still values, rather than as a substitute for. So that might be one of the things that I'm most careful about. I'm not claiming that I'm substituting for anything which is happening in the classroom. I'm just taking this great stuff which is happening in the classroom and making it even better.
Any thoughts on Jared Diamond's notion that the invention of agriculture was the single biggest mistake humans ever made?
Yeah, the famous essay by Jared Diamond, who articulated in a best-selling book, what was basically a position of geographic determinism, which is that we are prisoner to our geography. Wherever you came from in the world, that kind of like sets the course. And really, to me, it is a very future confining vision. So I am not in support of that vision. The idea that agriculture was an invention is also one that bugs me. I'll give a quick example. I used to say, following Jared Diamond and following Jim Scott, when our students would talk about wheat, I would say, let's now thank 10,000 years of Neolithic seed breeders who were able to recognize that if we wanted to have good wheat production, we would have the trait of a non-brittle rachis, which is how tightly the wheat stalk holds on to its seeds. Because of course, if you're a sensible plant, when it's time to set seed, you disperse, you shoot your seeds everywhere. That's what a sensible plant would do. If you are a sensible Neolithic agriculturalist, you want a plant that holds onto its seeds tight so that they are there, ready for harvest. And that's a tricky thing to do from a plant breeding perspective. Takes a lot of foresight and a lot of multi-generational planning. And so I was saying, let's honor that multi-generational planning that happened. And it was actually like a first-year student who was saying, like, well, if you were a Neolithic seed saver, wouldn't you just be saving the seeds that were on the plant anyways? Like, it's not like you're poking around in the dirt to find all of these widely dispersed seeds. And you realize, oh yeah, there is actually a kind of auto-domestication at play, right? Where it is through the act of saving seeds that we save seeds that can be saved. And when you apply that kind of thinking to many of the other traits that you find in, say, a commodity grain, you realize, oh, it's through the act of taxing grains that we have grains that can be taxed. It's through the act of storing grains that we have grains that can be stored. It's through the act of transporting grains that we have grains that can be transported. There are things that are happening here that are emergent properties of more the physiology of the plant and the interests of the humans, not in terms of a planned out thing that was the worst mistake in human history. All right. So that's kind of my example.
Mark, I think I've time for last question. I'm going to take the liberty just briefly. So Yale Farm seems to be very focused on education. Like, it's amazing, right? Like, challenging to imagine 40 classes all doing their own projects. But I'm also thinking it's Yale, a lead institution. lots of layers upon layers of hierarchy. And I just wanted to know, beyond the undergraduate student focus, has the farm been a space for creating different kinds of community ties? Has it been a space at all for rethinking collaboration across kinds of staff beyond faculty and so forth?
We've barely scratched the surface in terms of what we can do. The work to focus on teaching, and as I put it when I arrived, and we were kind of like trying to confer some academic legitimacy on what we were doing, I was sort of saying, like, everything that we plant, we want to be able to show either citation or credit from this, right? We want this to either be something that's published or something which is granting university credit, and that's what we're going to make our decisions based on. We have almost arrived there, I think, where that's recognized. That was a kind of like strategic filter that needed to be done. We're a pretty small outfit compared, and we don't have the history that many of the other units at Yale have. And so we did have to narrow that focus basically to say, we're making a contribution to the core academic mission. And because we had to be focused in that way, it also meant that we had to tactically cut off some potential ties that would have been wonderful to pursue with the wider community in New Haven, with the graduate and professional schools. It was really just a matter of what can we actually accomplish and what focus is needed right now that will get us to the next step. So yeah, I mean, the future's wide open in terms of those collaborations, but I don't have anything to report back yet so much. There's been ongoing things, especially with the removal of the farmers market as the main place where the food was distributed. The food is all distributed now through like emergency food provision channels and mutual aid channels. And we try and make sure that there's a strong bridge with like a well-established nonprofit that knows New Haven and has roots in the community, and that we also have spaces for the more experimental nonprofits that students are inevitably going to start up, and many of them will fail. But we really want to make sure that there's sort of like a continual support and advocacy to continue to do those kinds of experiments as well. So the food is going through those channels. But yeah, when it comes to how is the city of New Haven rethinking its ecologies? How are the public schools rethinking their ecologies? All of these questions, they remain like wide open. And I wish I could report something, but if you're allowed to have me back for a third time, maybe in 10 years, I'll be able to tell you.
To be continued. Join me in thanking Mark, please.